Welcome to this Considered Opinions podcast.
I'm Dougal.
And I'm Celia. Thank you for joining us. Isak Dinesen said, "To be a person is to have a story to tell." So what are our stories? Stories are what define us. They shape our lives and they get under our skin and they become so deeply ingrained and embedded in our lives and in our thinking that sometimes it can be hard to recognize the origin of some of our stories that we tell ourselves.
It's like it's the raw material, the raw information that we use to make sense or give meaning to our life or our experiences. You know, I grew up with very much a science and logic background, and I'd been taught to treat facts and figures as the be all and end all, but in many respects those facts and figures are meaningless without the story
that
goes with it.
Yes, the story that we tell ourselves, if you actually think about it, there's always an internal narrative going on. We're always telling ourselves some kind of story, whether it's the list of things that we've got to do today, or whether we're reviewing how our day went, or we are making plans for the future. We are writing in our heads. There's an internal story making going on.
One of the key ones is we're evaluating. We don't like to admit that we judge our actions and other people's actions, but we do. We look at how people behave and we're forever saying that was good behavior, that was, selfish, or that was judgmental, which is
there is a
judgmental in itself.
Yeah, a constant evaluation going on.
Yes.
And I think that's quite a nice word, because the evaluation there is a summary. We're summarizing some actions or events that have happened to us. And so that in itself is a type of narrative.
And people have always told stories. I mean, this is something that goes back into prehistory.
We've always told stories, and we are always telling stories. If you ask somebody how their day was, there's a story there. If you tell a joke, that's actually a story.
Just a funny story.
Just a funny story.
Yeah.
People want stories. That's how you get their attention. That's how you keep their attention. And that's how we relate to each other. And that's how they help us to understand the world. They help us to process our experiences. And so stories are a fundamental part of life and human nature.
So what are some of the stories or narratives that society tells us? Because, part of the issue is simply being aware.
Well, that's it. You can't change something that you can't recognize. So if we are not aware that we've been told a story, and that rather than it being a fact, it's something that we've been sold a story on, then that will change how we behave. And the thing is that the stories that we tell ourselves or the stories that are told to us, they play a powerful role in shaping our belief system. And as we've discussed previously, belief leads to behavior, which leads to culture. So the stories are a fundamental part of the beginning of our culture.
And how many times have we heard over the recent past people talking about the narrative? What is a narrative but the story that we are being told? So the narrative might be Orange Man bad, or the narrative might be men are toxic, or the narrative might be children are a hindrance or a nuisance, or marriage is a ball and chain.
Yeah, and those are all stories. And the other thing is that stories don't come just through books or being told orally over the centuries. That's not just how stories occur. We can get stories through things like, if you watch an advert or you see an advert, there is some kind of storytelling going on in that advert that is affecting you on a fundamental psychological level. Essentially, it becomes a manipulation into buying a product that they're selling with the advert, but the story is there. That's a fundamental, integral part of that.
So this generates two thoughts to me. One is it's coming through any sort of media. So advertising, music, books, TV, movies, all of those avenues. And the second thing is examples of adverts recently that have really stood out because of the narrative that they're pushing. So one example is recently is Jaguar came out with a very woke ad, and they've had a lot of pushback, which is good news. And on the other hand, well, there's been two actually. One was Volvo and one was Apple coming out with very family-friendly ads, and they've been received much better. So that's a case of the narrative changing in a good way.
Well, if you watch those two adverts, it's very interesting because I would actually say that the Jaguar advert was not a story. It was a complete pastiche. It was a mashup of cliches, and it became what you might call preachy.
Yes.
It was very obviously telling you what to think and how to behave.
Yes.
Whereas the Volvo advert is telling a story. It starts with this woman discovering that she is pregnant. So it starts and then she goes off and to get something from the shop. And it's this whole story you see unfolding.
Yes.
In the advert. And those adverts that tell the stories, they're often the most popular. But the stories can even be, and I'm not saying it has to be a full like the Volvo ad is a full story like that. It can be that it might be a photograph, but it's a car advert, and it's a photograph of a convertible on the hillside above Monte Carlo. That in and of itself tells a story, but it's quite a clever way because you fill in all the blanks.
You use your imagination to beef out or bulk out the story.
Exactly. So that advert, it has a wider appeal because you're filling in the blanks. And so there's a lot of things that happen there. One is you want to have a convertible car. Two is you want to go to Monte Carlo. Three is you need if you're a guy, you need the James Bond suit, or you filled in all of these blanks, but it appeals to a wide range because whatever appeals to you, you fill in that story, and then it.
Do you think, sort of going back to how the Jaguar ad really fell short, and you sort of said it was a bit preachy, do you think this is because ultimately stories need to be somehow relatable? Their purpose is to reflect reality and somehow condense reality into some home truths that we can learn, and if it doesn't do that, if it's not believable, if it's somehow inauthentic, we naturally spot that very, very quickly, and the messaging is not very, very effective.
I think definitely. And the thing with that is that you always need a way in. You always need something relatable. Like you are not going to look at, just keeping with the adverts theme here, you're not going to look at a woman putting on this fantastic pair of shoes and going out and having a wonderful time.
I'm not going to find that very relatable. No.
You're not going to find that relatable. But for the same thing is, I'm not going to find the whole Ute advert very relatable.
You mean Barry Crump and Scotty roughing it through the back blocks of New Zealand isn't appealing?
It's not the relatable for me. I see why it will relate to some guys, but yeah, it's
not your. Yeah. There we go.
And that is something that with the stories is different stories will appeal to different people. But the most powerful ones are the ones where we can imagine ourselves in it. We're part of it. You watch Lord of the Rings or you read Lord of the Rings and you are one minute you're Frodo and the next minute you're Aragorn. You know, you imagine yourself in that place.
Yes.
And so you really get into it.
Yes.
And that is one of the things with how stories get under your skin.
They get under your skin, they engage you emotionally, and it's sort of a way of doing an end run on the logic and rationality or disbelief. When you hear a good story, you will suspend your disbelief, and therefore you're more susceptible to learning whatever it is that story has to teach you.
And I'm reminded of a quote. It was, "I read not because I have no life, but because I have many."
Nice, like it. I like it.
And so that is how these stories really, we become part of them as we experience these stories, but then they become part of us and how we then are shaped in our thinking.
Okay, all right. Here's where I do sort of fall back on the logic and rationality and science side of things. What if a story is a nice imaginative story, but it is essentially false? It's not reality. What if the stories don't match with reality? Is there a danger there that we will end up going off to moral conclusions or philosophical conclusions that are incorrect, which then can damage our life experience? So we start making bad decisions because we've got bad models because we've been listening to bad stories or stories which don't comport with reality.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why you need to make sure that there is a wide variety, but also that you are engaged in the real world, if you like. It's not all about like reading a book. And what you're talking about is, you know, having that very rich, imaginative life through books or movies. Does have its place in that. One of the most unrealistic story types, you could argue, is the fairy tale. I mean, people are very rude about the fairy tale in that, it sets you up for failure or unrealistic expectations. It's not all happily ever after. And true, I agree that a lot of the Disney movie types, I mean, not just Disney, but Marvel and blah, 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 they do teach you that you just have to have a fairy godmother who waves a wand.
Yes.
But if you actually look at traditional folk tales, fairy tales, there's actually a lot of teaching in that it takes hard work, it takes other people helping the protagonist. Also, it teaches you things like work ethic, the skills that the protagonist gains at the beginning of the story can save his life later on in the story.
Yes.
But also I think that they have a much more general benefit in that they don't tell us that dragons exist. We know that dragons exist. The metaphorical dragons exist.
Yeah, in real life, that dragon might have a human face and a human name, or it might be an illness, or we all have struggles and difficulties.
But the stories tell us that dragons can be beaten.
That's the key.
And so this is the benefit of the stories, is that they can encourage us. And they can uplift us. In academia, often they will dismiss stories with a very obvious didactic element. That's the teaching element. They've got a teaching part of the story. And that's very often dismissed in academia. But the thing is that actually all stories have a didactic element.
Yes.
Yes, some are more obvious than others, but they all have it. And that's why we actually turn to stories. Because another thing is that when you're struggling to navigate a problem in life, often the issue is because you don't know what success looks like.
Yes.
You've never experienced it. You haven't heard a story about somebody else experiencing it. And that makes the navigation of this issue harder.
Right. Take, for instance, Cinderella. In many respects, that is a story of going through hardship, having the ability to endure the hardship, and then being able to forgive at the end of it.
Yes.
And so if you haven't had that story, you don't know that even though you go through hardship and people treat you terribly, you can still be gracious and generous and forgiving to them at the end. once you've come through it all.
And so when we recognize these stories and the purposes of having stories in our lives, and we recognize that stories are integral to our socialization and the civilizing influence, if you like, then we can start to look at all of these stories that we've experienced and start to assess them in a much more discerning way.
Yes, I felt in many respects a lot of my adult life has been going through unlearning some of the erroneous stories. One of the ones I've been told is that men and women are antagonistic, that I was born into a culture that we talked about the battle of the sexes, and there were all these stories about men and women being at loggerheads. But then I had to unlearn that story and learn a new story that men and women were complementary.
And I think that brings us to the quality of the story. So just because something is a story doesn't mean it's true.
Yes.
And we have recognizing the stories, we then need that discernment to recognize the truthful, good stories and the destructive, untrue stories.
What are some of the, maybe some starting points to look at, one or two, to start thinking about as to why some social stories that we've been taught, or narratives, may be destructive? Narratives like, if it doesn't have a dollar sign before it, it has no value.
And that one means that we don't value any unpaid work. So volunteer work or any childcare that happens in the home.
Stopping and enjoying a sunset.
And then those things are not as status filled as stuff that takes money.
Yes.
If you enjoy your own sunset at home, it's not as valuable as if you've paid $3,000 to fly to somewhere else and enjoy a sunset.
Yeah. So why would not a sunset somewhere in New Zealand or suburbia be any less valuable than a sunset in Rarotonga or the Bahamas or Mallorca?
Yes, exactly.
Here's another one. We're taught that family is bad and that your freedom ends when either you get married or when you start a family.
Well, interestingly enough, that story actually comes from an anthropologist and a psychologist who started propagating the idea in the 1960s that the family was the cause of mental health issues.
Really?
Yes. And
yet we have a more anxious ridden society now.
Without the strong family, yes, we have a more anxious society and more mental health issues today than we did then. But they decided and they started to propagate this idea that families were responsible for mental health issues and that they would hold you back, that they were claustrophobic kind of and very limiting to the individual.
Whereas a counter narrative to that would be that family are likely to be your greatest allies.
Yes.
In life. And that and if you are looking to pair up with someone, that someone is going to have a massive influence in your life. So you better choose someone where the two of you together are greater than the sum of your parts.
That's a very good example of how the story that is told changes the cultural narrative, which changes how people behave.
And I think there's ramifications to having bad stories, so we need to be able to recognise or analyse or critique or discern the quality of stories we're telling ourselves. And that could be our own internal self-talk, it could be what we're listening to, what we're watching.
I think that recognising the stories, the cultural stories that we've often taken for granted, recognising the internal stories of our own dialogue about our own life, and then discerning the quality and value of those narratives is the first step in being proactive in how we want to live our lives and the sort of society and culture we want to create, because we start with belief and then that will translate into behavior, which then becomes the culture, because culture is a summation of behavior.
Yes. So let's start working on our stories and telling ourselves a better story.
Yeah, recognizing our stories and choosing the ones that we are going to propagate in our lives.
How would people go about practicing this? Is it a case of you sit down and think about the adverts you're listening to? Is it a case of you actually try and physically write your own stories?
I think the first thing is actually becoming aware of this and just like mulling the concept over. You will probably find that it's like when you get a new hammer, everything is a nail. You suddenly start seeing these things all over the place.
Yes.
And that is a huge step, because that is when we suddenly start really recognizing and we're evaluating these stories in real time in our lives. It's not overwhelming. It's not a big, oh, you have to change everything you've ever thought is wrong.
Yes.
That's not it. It's a case of we evaluate these stories and think, why do I think this? Where did this come from?
Yeah. So actually start to question what some of our basic beliefs are. Maybe it might help to try and verbalize it, talk it through with people, or write it down.
Some ideas, some stories, some beliefs will be very deeply ingrained as well.
But the point is that you're asking why, and
Yes.
you're not sitting at the superficial. You're digging deep, and one of the key things is that we've got this contradiction in our society. What I find when I get down to the bottom of the whys.
Just one final thing is that a lot of these things that we've talked about today, it's about letting it sit and letting it ruminate and just considering things slowly. Everybody's going to come to a slightly different conclusion, but it's not about a big change today. It's about sitting and thinking and letting ideas ruminate, germinate, and
Weeding out the weeds and encouraging the fruitful things, the positive things, the things that are actually adding real value to your life. Thank you for joining us for this Considered Opinions podcast. We look forward to seeing you again next time, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe.